I'm Dave Kluge, and you are watching Fantasy Pancake.
Yes, welcome in to Fantasy Pancake, and I am so excited for the guest that we have today for Pancake Stacks. Pancake Stacks is the show where we bring in the best guests from around the football industry. We ask them for 2 players that they love for the week ahead, 2 that they hate, and their Pancake Stack of the week. I promise that the format is not just based off the pun of Pancake Stacks, but that might be a tiny little bit of a lie. The guy that I have with me today has been one of my favorite content creators in the scene for so long, for basically as long as I've been following football, which to note isn't actually that long, Dave. So it's not trying to age you or anything. Dave, why don't you introduce yourself to people watching?
Yeah, I'm Dave Kluge. You can find all my content over at Football Guys. I've been with them for this is year 4 now, working with Football Guys exclusively. All my content is over there. I've got the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show that I do with Alfredo Brown. We are doing 5 episodes a week right now. In addition to that, I've got a Friday morning podcast that I do with Jeff Bell. I'm writing 3 articles a week. And then, of course, just sharing little tidbits and information, stats, data, jokes, memes, whatever I find interesting to my Twitter feed at Dave Kluge. So just follow me on Twitter at Dave Kluge, and you'll see all the content coming out on a daily basis.
And we were just saying before we got started about how much of a grind the football season is. That once things actually get started, it's so fun to watch football again. And then suddenly you're watching, but with a notepad in front of you. And then the game finishes and you're immediately grinding to find out the analytics and find out the tidbits for tweets. And then also looking at depth charts and going, oh crap, Puka Nacua just got injured. So do I need to think about Tyler Johnson next week? Or do I need to think about Demarcus Robinson? And have you actually managed to sleep at all in the week since we got started? Or how have you actually found now that football's got started again?
No, my health takes a pretty big hit this time of year. The other day, I was working, and then all of a sudden I looked down at my clock and it is 5:08 p.m. and I said I haven't eaten a thing yet today. I skipped breakfast, skip lunch, not staying hydrated, not getting the necessary sleep. I try my best to maintain, some sort of activity in season. I set my alarm for 5 a.m. and wake up early and try to get a workout in before I start my day. But it is a tough time of year. But I don't want to sound like I'm complaining by any means, because what I tell myself every single day, prior to doing this, what I'm doing right now, football content creation, podcasting, writing, all of that sort of stuff, I was a business to business salesman. And it's something that I was good at doing, and, it paid the bills. But I remind myself every single day that the worst day of doing this football content creation that I'm doing, the worst day of doing this is still better than the best day in my previous career. So try to take that step back every single day and just kind of think about things on a big picture. And I just feel incredibly lucky and blessed to be doing this, even if I am working 16-hour days.
Well, I appreciate you for sharing about half an hour of that 16 hours with me on today. So let's start taking a look towards week 2. And week 1 was absolutely fantastic. As a Rams fan, slightly less so, because even though the team showed a lot of heart in sort of taking the Lions to overtime, we also lost our second left tackle, our starting center, one of our starting guards. We're already without our starting right tackle, and crucially Puka Nacua, whose jersey I'm not actually wearing today, but I was wearing on Sunday. I don't know whether or not that means that I cursed him.
Some sort of jinx.
But obviously we have we do have a lot of injuries to deal with, and it does shake up the landscape. That the players that we thought we were in on beforehand, things actually, when football happens, turns out a little bit differently, and suddenly we have to be able to adapt to the information in front of us. And I'm really interested in the first player that you've got to talk about as someone that you love for week 1, because I think this seems like somewhere where you've been able to look and go, I don't know, maybe you were in on him the whole off season, but it seems like somewhere you're able to go, okay, the information of my eyes is different to what I thought it was 2 weeks ago, and now I'm going in on this player, especially for week 2. So who's the first player that you love for the week ahead?
J.K. Dobbins going up against the Carolina Panthers. I love the matchup, but more than anything, I'm a huge fan of J.K. Dobbins. And, when I first started kind of scouting rookies and getting into rookie content, I would watch J.K. Dobbins film from Ohio State, and I was just blown away by how good he was in that incoming class. And you got to remember, that's an incoming class that had DeAndre Swift and Clyde Edwards-Helaire and a lot of other really talented running backs. To me, J.K. Dobbins was the second best running back in that class behind only Jonathan Taylor. And
Wow.
every single year, I was pounding the table for J.K. Dobbins, and it was just injury after injury after injury, just one thing after another. And this was the first offseason where I said, I need to take a step back and kind of look at his entire career. We're looking at that catastrophic knee injury where he tore his ACL, MCL, LCL, meniscus, and hamstring, comes back the next year, blows his Achilles out. And I just said, I think this is the end of the road for J.K. Dobbins. As much as I love the talent in college, loved what I saw his rookie season, I just didn't think he would be able to recapture that magic that we saw early in his career. And of course, he did. He had a fantastic game on Sunday, and I went back and I watched that game, and he looked great. Like all of the things that I loved about J.K. Dobbins early in his career, the explosiveness, the burst, the strength, the vision, it was all there. And he's doing all the things that he's supposed to. Of course, everybody sees the 2 breakaway runs where he was chased down and tackled, but we saw that last year with Breece Hall, if you remember, when he came back from injury. When you're, coming back from recovery, you don't have that conditioning up to where it should be, so I think that, a healthier J.K. Dobbins would also have 2 extra touchdowns on his day that we didn't get, but it was really the small things in his game that I got really excited about. He was hitting the holes the way that he was supposed to. He was keeping his legs churning. He was taking negative plays and turning them into positive plays. It seems like he really understands the intricacies of this offensive line and how to make plays behind them. So if you look at the usage and snap shares, it appears as if he was in a split with Gus Edwards, but he's clearly the more talented running back. You look at his athleticism, his age, his pedigree, you name it. J.K. Dobbins checks about every single box that Gus Edwards doesn't. And the only concern this year, and the concern that I had, was his health and whether he'd be able to bounce back after a down season. But I think it's pretty obvious after watching what he did in week one that he clears that as well. And it's not just the eye test either. Rushing yards over expectation, rushing EPA. He led the league in week one. So the eyes tell me that he's back. The advanced analytics tell me that he's back. So I am way in on J.K. Dobbins. And, I think when it comes to quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends, you want to exercise some patience. We are pretty good at projecting these guys season long. And even though some guys might have had disappointing or unpredictable boom weeks in week one at the wide receiver position, we know that over time that's going to kind of average itself out. But the running back position is one that I'm willing to make some pretty big swings after 1 week because you have all of these ambiguous situations. And in the offseason, we looked at the Chargers and we saw J.K. Dobbins and we saw Gus Edwards and we saw Kamani Vidal and we said, we don't know where these touches are going. We don't know who the best running back is, but it is very clear after week one that J.K. Dobbins is their best running back. So this is a guy that I, unfortunately, as much as I love him, wasn't drafting a lot of this offseason. But going into week two, I've got him as my RB17. I'm starting him in leagues ahead of David Montgomery, Brian Robinson, Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard. I think that that's kind of how we should be viewing J.K. Dobbins is as a middling RB2 with elite RB1 upside on any given week.
I think that's really interesting. And I think there's a point that you made there that I just want to touch back on, which is how we scout running backs and how we look into not just the results of the box score and actually the plays that become more impactful for us as analysts in order to learn the truth behind what we're seeing. And so much of that is looking at actually the yards after first contact and looking at the film to see how they're hitting the holes, because obviously you see the two huge breakaway runs and that impacts the box score so much in the end, especially because Gus Edwards just isn't going to do that. As much as J.K. Dobbins might have been caught by behind, Gus Edwards would have been caught about 30 yards closer
Right.
to where he started. But I think the ability to actually look in and go, well, what are we actually seeing here? How is he hitting the holes? How is he dealing with first contact? What's his vision looking like? What's that initial burst looking like? That's going to translate to season-long fantasy success more than, I mean, at a different position. But say, for example, Alec Pierce caught 2 deep passes and finished as the wide receiver 3 on the week, but that's not sustainable going forward. So it's about looking in week one, what can we trust and what actually might not be something that's going to be able to be repeated across the course of the season. I'd just like to ask about J.K. Dobbins. So you said at the end there sort of high-end RB1 upside. Do you think there's a case in which kind of the work over the course of the next few weeks starts to lean from 50-50 to 55-45, 60-40, 65-35? Like, do you think the offense and Greg Roman in particular will trust J.K. Dobbins once they see that it seems like he's healthy and he'll become more of a bell cow? Or do you think his ceiling is kind of limited? Because obviously, even in Baltimore, Greg Roman would split the touches between these exact two backs. So do you think his upside is going to kind of be limited by the fact that the OC probably won't trust him to give him kind of full workhorse status? Or do you think that actually the difference between the two is so night and day that J.K. Dobbins has that upside and that edge to be able to be kind of an RB1 in our lineups and on the season?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And there is a historical penchant for Greg Roman to want to split up touches a little bit, but we can look back at his rookie season, and J.K. Dobbins, through the first 6 weeks of his rookie year, only saw 4.2 carries per game. And then from week 8 onward, after he had kind of proven himself to be somebody who understands the system and understands the intricacies and the speed of the NFL, then we saw his usage really blow up. He had double-digit carries in all but one game from week 8 onward, averaged 12.1 attempts and over a target per game. So we did see early in the season during his rookie year that they leaned towards Gus Edwards, but it took until about week 6 for the scales to tip in J.K. Dobbins' favor. And I think we could see something similar here. We might even see it a little bit faster than we saw his rookie year, because J.K. Dobbins is now a guy going into his 5th year in the NFL rather than his rookie season. So there's going to be a little bit more trust there with Greg Roman. We always want to say that the more talented back is going to get the work. And anybody who's played fantasy football for the last few years saw this same argument with guys like Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard, where Tony Pollard was clearly excelling in the advanced metrics and the efficiency metrics, but they kept giving the ball to Ezekiel Elliott. That's because Ezekiel Elliott does a lot of the things that don't show up on the stat sheet in pass protection and, just being a threat at the goal line, a guy who can pick up the hard yards. J.K. Dobbins does all of those things, though, and he already is a good, well-rounded running back. So I absolutely see him taking a larger share of the work here. But the other thing I want to talk about is, you mentioned the elite RB1 upside, and I think that that's going to scare off a lot of people. This much better with his conditioning last week. If he was able to finish those 2 runs, we're looking at a 38-point game from J.K. Dobbins. I mean, he was this close to breaking off 2 big touchdowns, and that would have given him a 38-point outing in week 1. So we already saw it. Like, he didn't finish those runs because of the poor conditioning coming back from the injury. But, I mean, he was so close to being the RB1 on the week. So I think that ceiling is there, and it's something that we can expect going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to close off on J.K. Dobbins, this is a player that I'm absolutely delighted to see back in the NFL and healthy. This is someone that, like you said at the beginning, I've been really in on for the past few seasons, and has been so disheartening to see him just get injured over and over and over again. And when things was looking up, then something else happens. And I think it's just so good for him as a person, less so a player, to actually be able to show off the talent that he undoubtedly has. So yeah, like I find myself really rooting for him to continue that success, just because I think the bloke deserves it. I think the guy deserves to see some success in the NFL after what he's been through the past few years. It can't have been easy for him. Let's move on to the first player that you hate for week 1. So from a running back that you were slightly lower on in the offseason, that you're now starting to react to the evidence in front of you and become higher on, this guy is kind of flipped the other way. Who is the first player that you hate for week 1?
Well, I feel obligated to say that I don't hate anybody. Okay, I just I want to say that, Lewis. I understand. We gotta market the shows. We do the same thing. We have our love hate segment, but I don't hate Tyjae Spears, but I do not like him in this matchup, and I definitely don't want him in my fantasy football lineup. Going up against the New York Jets is a tough matchup, but it's not even the matchup so much that scares me about Tyjae Spears. It's that our offseason expectations were that Tyjae Spears and Tony Pollard were going to coexist in some sort of committee or a timeshare, whatever you want to call it. And that was galvanized in the offseason when they released their depth chart and said RB1A and RB1B. And everybody said, well, this is going to be close to a 50-50 split. We absolutely did not see that in week one. What we saw was Tony Pollard seeing 4 times as many carries, getting almost 3 times as many scrimmage yards, and not only dominating in the snaps and the opportunities, but also just looking like the much better running back. He generated 4.4 yards after contact per attempt. That's great for a running back. He averaged almost a yard over expectation as a rusher, which is also great as a running back. So this guy was dominating snaps, he was dominating touches, and he was highly efficient with the touches. So I think now, and going into week two, we've already got word from Brian Callahan that they want to get Tyjae Spears more involved, but that is one of those quotes we hear from coaches all the time that I'm willing to just throw out the window. Like we hear a coach say, we want to get this player more involved. If you wanted to get him more involved, you'd have gotten him more involved. I think that there's clearly a preference
You're the
here.
person who actually can do that. You're the one
Exactly.
person that can get them more
Right.
involved.
Right. Like there's no deep investigation that needs to be had. You're the play caller and you chose to give the touches to Tony Pollard. So I think that maybe over the course of the season, we could see this tighten up a little bit and Tyjae Spears gets some more looks going forward. But right now, we've only got 1 week of the season to look back at. And when you look back at that season, you see Tony Pollard clearly in a workhorse role, Tyjae Spears watching from the sideline. So going into week two, I don't want to trust Tyjae Spears in my starting lineup. That could change going into week three. It could change going into week eight. These volatile running back rooms are really tough to get a read on. But based on what we've seen so far through the first week of the season, I am A-OK benching Tyjae Spears this week, kind of taking a wait and see approach. But the reality is that he might just be a handcuff who needs an injury to get on the field. So I always try to make the advice actionable, and that's why I told you some guys that I would start J.K. Dobbins ahead of some of the guys that I'd start ahead of J.K. Dobbins, and here with Tyjae Spears, I'll do the same. I've got Jalen Warren playing at Denver. I've got him ranked ahead of Tyjae Spears. I've got Justice Hill, who saw 8 targets last week. I've got him going up against Las Vegas ahead of Tyjae Spears. And then I've got Zach Charbonnet, assuming Kenneth Walker's out. I'll play him ahead of Spears, and then Jaleel McLaughlin, who that's another one where we kind of had to change our stance a little bit, right? Like we thought Javonte Williams was going to be a workhorse and we thought a little bit of Jaleel McLaughlin would get mixed in. What we saw in week one is that is going to be more of a 50-50 split. So at this point right now, based on what we saw through the first week of the season, I will play Jaleel McLaughlin, who's in an actual timeshare, over Tyjae Spears, who appears to be the clear RB2.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of ties into something that I mentioned on a week one learning show that I did with Tyler at Emo Cowboy on Tuesday. And basically it's about kind of the way in which that we will view the running back position based off the evidence that teams are telling us. So essentially saying follow the money, right? So the Titans, when they signed Tony Pollard, was very strange. We didn't really expect them to be going out for that kind of running back because he profiles quite similarly to Tyjae Spears in someone who is more electric in space, who's thrived in the receiving game, more of a third down back traditionally rather than a workhorse. They went out and paid him this $21 million 3-year deal that all of the top running backs got in free agency. And looking back on it, the team was telling us that this is the guy who at the beginning of the season they wanted to see on the field because teams don't like being seen to having to have wasted money. So when they've paid that amount of money to a player, they will go out and use them at the beginning of the season. And I think this can be quite a hard thing as an analyst because we might look and go, but I like Tyjae Spears more than I like Tony Pollard. I like this player who's on the depth chart behind the starter more than the guy who's being paid the money. How do you tend to weigh that up into your process? I mean, this is more of an off-season thing in terms of I think that they should be starting this guy, but it
So
seems like they're going to start this one.
I don't want to, disparage anybody else's analysis, but I am somebody when it comes to contracts and following the money, that is something that has just completely out of my process at this point. Because it's something a few years back, I would use that narrative at times, and it has just burned us so many times year after year after year, and especially trying to compare Tony Pollard's contract, who is on his second deal after a franchise tag. He's on his second deal in the NFL compared to Tyjae Spears, who is still on his rookie contract. Give it a day 3 rookie contract where it's going to be very suppressed in cost. It's tough for me to compare the two. And I could just I can go through so many instances over the years where we have followed the money and it has led us to dead ends. Remember, Jonnu Smith got $50 million to play with the New England Patriots and did nothing. Kenny Golladay got $72 million to play for the New York Giants and did nothing. So, I understand the idea behind it. And there are instances where highly paid players do perform well. At the end of the day, I just don't think it's that predictive. Teams make stupid decisions all the time. And a lot of times people pay guys money that don't deserve the big money. I don't think Tony Pollard's one of these situations. I think he's one where he was paid well and he's going to perform well.
Yeah.
But we can look at the Ravens just last week. They paid Derrick Henry a lot of money, and Derrick Henry didn't look very great. Like, it looks like the years of usage are starting to wear on him. DeAndre Swift got paid a ton of money. He didn't look very great either. So if you look at all of the running backs this year that got these big contracts, Tony Pollard probably clears and deserves that money. And I think Saquon Barkley probably deserves that money. And I think Josh Jacobs probably deserves that money. But we can look at Derrick Henry and, who was the other guy that I just mentioned? Already drawn a blank. Swift, exactly. Derrick Henry and DeAndre Swift is guys who were paid big money and might not even be their team's actual RB1.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I completely get that. And as someone who had to suffer through the excitement about the Allen Robinson offseason a few seasons ago and then seeing what he looked like on the
Exactly.
field after being paid all that money, I completely get it.
Yes. Yes.
Let's move on to the second player that you love for week 2. And this is someone that I'm really intrigued to know about your off-season thoughts on them as well, because this is a very controversial player. Who is the second person that you love for week 2?
So, Jameson Williams this week in week 2 playing against Tampa Bay, I really like him. And I got to be honest, Jameson Williams coming into the league, loved him. Loved the prospect, loved the speed, loved the draft capital, loved the landing spot, all of these things. But I started to feel like maybe the bust meter was starting to tick a little bit with Jameson Williams. You see almost no production year 1, and granted that was him coming off of an ACL tear, missing out on training camp, missing out on preseason, so that was excusable, if you will. And then in year 2, there was the gambling suspension, and there were reports about him dropping catches, and there were reports about him being a bad teammate, and that's when I started to kind of get these worries that like maybe he just isn't cut out for the NFL. So going into this season, I was very in on Jameson Williams in the spring and summer. And then his ADP just kept creeping up and kept creeping up and kept creeping up, and got to a point where I said, I think I'm kind of out on Jameson Williams. And I feel like week 2, heading into week 2, is a really good time for us to kind of face our mistakes. We'll talk about the next guy that I quote unquote hate is probably an offseason mistake of mine, and J.K. Dobbins. I talked about it. I didn't have a lot of J.K. Dobbins this offseason, but saw enough in week 1 that I'm willing to eat that take. And Jameson Williams wasn't a guy that I was aggressively touting at all this offseason. And actually, last week on the Football Guys Fantasy Football Show, I said if you have Jameson Williams, it's probably best to bench him, kind of take a wait and see approach, see what he does. And then if he plays well in week 1, then you plug him into your week 2 lineup. So I'm sorry to anybody who took that advice and waited, but now we saw, like I said, wait and see. Well, we saw, like, he looked fantastic. He has the same game-breaking speed that we fell in love with at Alabama. He drew a team-high 9 targets, and I don't think that is going to be something we can count on every single week. I think that we're going to see Amon-Ra St. Brown, a bigger part of the game plan in this upcoming week 2. But I mean, the big play potential is there with Jameson Williams. He scored that 52-yard touchdown and made it look effortless. We saw some of the speed through the playoffs and at the end of last season as well. So I think this is one of those things where the cat's out of the bag. This is a good player with game-breaking speed. And while they've got Amon-Ra St. Brown able to win underneath, and they've got Sam Laporta who can win deep and across the middle of the field, they've got a strong run game. They've got a strong offensive line. The one thing that's been missing from this offense for the last 2 years has been a big play specialist, and that's what Jameson Williams is. So 9 targets is probably close to his weekly ceiling, but wouldn't be surprised if he continues to get 5 to 7 targets every single week. And he's got the skill and the athleticism that any one of those touches can go for an 80, 90-yard touchdown. So when you've got that sort of upside on any given week, I'm okay going with it. So I've got him inside my top 24 this week, ahead of Amari Cooper, who's coming off of a down week, ahead of Stephon Diggs, who, Diggs caught 2 touchdowns and everyone loves that, but only had 6 targets and only had 9 air yards. So had he not been bailed out by those touchdowns, we'd probably be panicking a little bit about Stephon Diggs. So Jameson Williams is a guy that I was a little lukewarm on this offseason, but after what I saw in week 1, just like J.K. Dobbins, willing to move him up the ranks a bit.
Yeah, Stephon Diggs, by the way, like was not that far off that classic Mike Williams stat line of like two
Yep.
targets, two receptions, two touchdowns, 2 yards. Like it was that
Yep.
sort of thing. Jameson Williams is a really interesting one to me, and I kind of went through a similar journey with JMO, that he was my wide receiver one in that class. I absolutely loved the film. I thought it would translate beautifully to the NFL. I thought he was going to hit the ground running day one as someone who, not quite in the John Ross type of like just a deep threat, but had that ability to stretch the field, but also could sort of take an underneath route all the way to the house, and be able to work on all three levels. And he was someone that I really loved. And then I've really sort of strayed away from that, particularly this last offseason, just because the evidence of 2 seasons where it hasn't really happened made me think, okay, well, chances are it's probably not going to. So I don't have any Jameson Williams anywhere, and I'm very upset about that, especially looking this week in the highest over under of the week, playing the Bucks. 2 great offenses, or offenses that we think have the potential to be great. I was just writing up Chris Godwin for a different website, and basically the conclusion being start every player in this game. I think it's probably the one on the week that I think is set to explode. I'll ask the same sort of thing with Jameson Williams as I did with J.K. Dobbins. And obviously, with J.K. Dobbins, you have the ability to continue to get that volume, because it's so much a volume-based position. With Jameson Williams, obviously, there are the 2 other targets there that we know are elite, and we have seen elite seasons from in the past few years. What do you think Jameson Williams' ceiling is on kind of a season-long basis, now that we think he actually has managed to put it together, and contribute to the Detroit Lions and sort of set in stone that wide receiver 2 spot?
If you're talking ceiling outcome, like best case scenario, I don't think it's crazy to think that Jameson Williams can finish inside the top 12. And I know that is a wildly lofty expectation, but we've seen that a lot of offenses can kind of hyper funnel through 2 wide receivers. And they do have Sam Laporta there, which is going to take a chunk of the target share for himself. But Sam Laporta wasn't an elite target earner last year. He really buoyed a lot of his production with touchdowns. So I can see this offense really funneling through Jameson Williams and Amon St. Brown. And top 12 sounds crazy, but when you think about it, this is a team that's going to play almost all of their games indoors. They've got a very good quarterback in Jared Goff, and then they operate in completely separate parts of the field. So I think what we saw last week isn't going to be something that we see going forward, where Jameson Williams is the target leader on the team. But I think what we'll see going forward is, Jameson Williams being able to get deep and stretch defenses vertically. Now that teams that they're going to be playing against know that Jameson Williams is healthy and ready to play, that's going to put that threat on defenses where they're going to be playing a little bit deeper. They're going to be on their heels expecting that big play, which opens up even more routes underneath for Amon St. Brown. So I think Amon St. Brown could still finish inside the top 5 like we had projected in the offseason, and Jameson Williams could still finish inside the top 12. Now that's the ceiling, of course. I think the realistic outcome is that Amon St. Brown continues what he does underneath and finishes a top 5 receiver, and Jameson Williams probably finishes somewhere inside the 20 to 30 range. But considering Jameson Williams was getting drafted as the wide receiver 40 or even cheaper than that in some drafts, if you're getting top 20 production from him or even top 30 production from him, and you get those spike weeks along the way, it's absolutely worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like it's such a dynamic offense, it's so hard to defend, because you think, you go with more down linemen to try and defend the run and that incredible offensive line, and you'll get killed over the middle of the field. You try to load up the middle of the field, and then Jameson Williams beats you deep. You try to keep 2
Right.
safeties deep and sort of have a high shell, and suddenly the middle of the field's open, or the run game's open, or Jameer Gibbs out the backfield, who's we've not even mentioned really. Like,
Right.
they're so loaded on this offense. So no, I really, really like this one, and particularly looking towards this matchup for this week.
And that's
We
exactly
will
what you see
come
Kansas City
to
doing this year. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but they're doing the same exact thing where they had the really good guys that could work underneath in Rashee Rice and Travis Kelce. And what they didn't have was the deep threat that could get behind safeties. So they doubled their chances this year. They said, we're going to sign Marquise Brown and we're going to draft Xavier Worthy. And all of a sudden we have those complementary pieces and we have a full-fledged offensive passing attack. And that's exactly what the Lions have.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much of it is about the complementary pieces, and it's about the ability to attack all 3 levels of the field with different weapons. There's, some receivers can do all 3, but if you can get 3 receivers that can do all 3 separately, suddenly you open up so much more in that offense, in the ability to make a defense unable to sort of stack one area of the field and know that they can just shut you down there. Yes, we will come to the final player that I'm going to hate as well. But if you are still here, if you are still watching, I would please ask you to subscribe. The channel is so new. We're only in week 3 now. We've already breaking through 100 subscribers. I have such an incredible guest with me today who I'm so grateful for. But if you can subscribe, we will have more guests in future, more content like this in future, and hopefully you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. So Dave, you've hinted at it already about the last player. Let's call it the player that you're lower on for week 2. Who is the final player?
Hate, despise, loathe. I can't stand this guy. No, I'm not crazy about Zamir White going up against Baltimore this year. And this is one of those guys, Zamir White, that I think is a pretty underrated rusher. But we just got way over our skis this offseason. And I've been a fan of Zamir White since he came into the league. But we got to read the tea leaves a little bit. Like right when the season ended and we saw that end of year finish from Zamir White last year, I did my first batch of 2024 draft rankings, and I had Zamir White as my RB16 or RB17. I can't remember exactly. But then things changed. They brought in Alexander Madison, who certainly is no slouch. They drafted Dylan Laube, a guy who specializes as a pass catching back. And, well, those aren't nails in the coffin for a very good running back. They are nails in the coffin for a guy who is a maybe slightly above league average back, which is what I think Zamir White is. And what we saw in week 1 was that they are going to use Alexander Madison on passing downs. And that was the big fear with Zamir White. This is a guy who did pull some targets when he was in that workhorse role last year, but it's not something we've ever seen done over a long period of time. At Georgia, he wasn't catching a lot of catches. There was first few years in the league, he wasn't catching a lot of passes. So now what we're looking at with Zamir White, unfortunately, is a guy who's only getting early down work and goal line work, but I don't know how much goal line opportunities are going to be there for the Las Vegas Raiders. So we're probably seeing a guy who's getting a lot of what I like to call low calorie touches, where he's not catching targets and he's not scoring touchdowns. And yeah, he might get 14 to 16 carries, but if he's averaging 3 yards per carry and he's not pulling targets and he's not scoring touchdowns, that doesn't help you all that much. So I like Zamir White, but you look at the implied total for this game and you look at who Vegas prefers, it's a game where the Raiders are probably going to fall from behind at some point. And if they do that, they're going to have to abandon the run. And when they abandon the run, that means Zamir White's going to be watching from the sideline. So this could be one that could get out of hand quickly. And if you're starting Zamir White, you have to be prepared for a world where he only gets 7 or 8 carries in the first few drives, and then they fall back 2 scores, and then they have to switch to Madison and Dylan Laube in a pickup offense. So you could be potentially looking at a 3 or 4 point outing from Zamir White. So I hate to say it because I think he is a very talented runner. He's got the game-breaking speed, but given the outlook of this team and the matchup that they have this week, I've got Zamir White outside of my top 36, which means you've probably got better options at running back.
Can I ask where you have Matson in your rankings currently?
Yes, I am pulling that up right now. I believe they are pretty close with a slight preference to Madison. Yeah, I've got Madison as my RB32 and Zamir White is my RB37.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. I think I'd probably lean a very similar way. We were talking about this before we started recording about the off-season running back and the way in which that we will boost a running back up in the off-season because the players that have left around them as opposed to anything they've done on the field. And even though these players are often very talented, there's always the argument that Zamir White is actually more talented than Josh Jacobs and Tony Pollard was more talented than Ezekiel Elliott, and Alexander Mattison was more talented than Dalvin Cook. Very funny that Mattison is now the Mattison to Zamir White again, that he's sort of done the same thing in reverse. But has this kind of changed your thinking? Basically, do you think that Zamir White is now going to be sort of the same disappointing second string running back that we've had the past few years? You brought up Chase Edmonds and Mike Davis as well, like from years gone by. Do you think Zamir White is probably going to end up falling into the same camp, or do you think that if this offense starts to take a leap forwards and they actually do end up kind of being on the winning side of a few more games, that Zamir White could end up sort of finishing in the top 24 and reestablishing himself?
That's exactly it. That for a guy with Zamir White's profile, a guy who only profiles to take carries and isn't going to be very involved in the passing game, those guys typically only do well when they're on teams that win a lot of games. And I think Derrick Henry is kind of the poster child for this, right? Like when Derrick Henry was on a good team that was winning games, he got to rack up 120 yards in the second half of almost every single football game. And then all of a sudden the Tennessee Titans are bad and he doesn't get afforded that luxury, and all of a sudden his fantasy production starts to fall off a little bit. Now we're looking at Zamir White in a similar position where he is a rushing only running back on a poor team. The difference is that Zamir White isn't anywhere near the level of talent that Derrick Henry is. So where Derrick Henry was still able to irk out a top 20 finish, we're probably not going to see the same from Zamir White. So I think that, yeah, if week one is any indication of what to expect going forward, Zamir White, unfortunately, probably follows the plight of many other dead zone running backs.
Yeah, I would not be surprised in the slightest. Let's close out the show with the titular feature, and that is Pancake Stacks. This is where we just look at your favorite stack of the week for week two. Dave, who do you have?
Now, I hope I understood the assignment here. You know, I wasn't looking for a value stack or anybody deep down there or anything. My favorite stack, though, is Jalen Hurts and AJ Brown. I am such a big fan of AJ Brown's talent, and you know, if what we saw last week is that the tush push isn't quite as effective as it was without Jason Kelsey. So I think that they're going to ask Jalen Hurts to throw the ball a little bit more, and we saw that last week where he attempted 34 pass attempts. And looking at the matchup they have versus Atlanta. Atlanta didn't have a great team. I think a lot of people were underwhelmed by what we saw in week one. They've got some pieces on defense, but this game does have shootout potential. So AJ Brown, we saw him in a completely different role last week than we've seen in years past, where Kellen Moore was moving him all over the formation. We saw him regularly in motion. We saw him out wide. We saw him in the slot. And I think that creative usage for AJ Brown is going to give us similar production to guys like we've seen Keenan Allen last year with Kellen Moore and CeeDee Lamb 2 years ago with Kellen Moore. I think we can see that type of usage and production from AJ Brown. So Jalen Hurts, I think his ceiling season long might be capped a little bit because he's not going to be rushing for 15 plus touchdowns like he has previously. Saquon Barkley's there. The offensive line isn't the same. But I think that because of those factors, we're going to see him dropping back and throwing more. And if he is throwing more, the guy who's going to benefit the most is AJ Brown. So on the week, I have Jalen Hurts is my QB1 this week. I had a Lamar Jackson, I had a Josh Allen, I had a Patrick Mahomes, all those guys. And AJ Brown is my wide receiver 5 on the week behind only Amon-Ra, Cooper Kupp, CeeDee Lamb, and Tyreek Hill.
Yeah, no, I really like it. And I think this is a really interesting thing that we were so frustrated with the Eagles offense last year, and with the way they were putting things together. And now they've brought in Kellen Moore and things look completely different. And obviously the loss of Jason Kelsey is going to have a huge impact. But it's mad the way that you probably wouldn't think in most offenses that the loss of the center is going to have such an impact on the wide receiver one. You'll think about that for the running game, and if they have a running quarterback, maybe that'll be of impact. And obviously the new running back, that's going to make a difference. But the lack of the touch push and the ability to now have to throw the ball a little bit more, I think you're absolutely right. This does sort of boost AJ Brown's ceiling. And he obviously, like, we know he's a top 10, top 5 most talented wide receiver in the league. So I really like this one for this week and for the year ahead. And if you've managed to snag it in your redraft lineups, then absolutely you will be going ahead with it. And I'll be very jealous if you did manage to do it, because it was quite hard to do, I think, around that 2-3 or 3-4 turn.
You had to reach for Jalen Hurts, or you had to hope that he really slid below ADP. That was the only way it was really working out this year.
Yeah, it was a very hard one to do. I definitely managed to nail it in a couple of DraftKings lineups where I managed to just go, do you know what, screw it, I'm just going to take it, and I'm just going to let those 40 points a week stay on my lineup as opposed to someone else's. But no, I really, really like this one, and you know, this for DFS as well is going to be a huge week winner. Hopefully so. Dave, thank you so much for coming on. For context for anyone watching, I reached out to Dave when I was thinking of setting up a YouTube channel, and I wanted to just talk to as many content creators as possible to get their advice on how to set things up and how to get started. And Dave was the first person to come back to me, and also one of the most followed people on Twitter that I reached out. So, you know, I was thinking I'm new on the scene. I'm not expecting people to come back. but I'm just going to message all of the people that I really like consuming their content. And Dave came back immediately and offered to have a chat with me. And we chatted for about an hour. And I said at the end, if I do get started, will you come on? And he's here as the second guest. So huge thanks to you, Dave, not just for coming on today and kind of chatting with me about week 2, because that's been great fun, but also I don't know if I would have had the confidence to get started on this without that hour that I spent with you over video call. So
The hardest
thank you
thing
so
is getting
much.
started. The hardest thing is getting started, and I remember telling you that when we talked a few months ago. So glad that you took the plunge. Really excited to see where this leads, and hoping and rooting for your success. You're a great guy. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the last few months, and I will be doing whatever I can to help promote your content, because we love overseas fans. You know, it's great to see the sport growing every single year.
Yeah, thank you, man. And you just want to remind people, in case there's anyone watching a Fantasy Pancake YouTube channel who doesn't know who Dave Kluge is, do you want to remind them where they can find you?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter at Dave Kluge. I'll share all of my content from Football Guys there, at Dave Kluge on Twitter.
Amazing. So thank you so much for joining me today, Dave, and thank you so much to you for watching. This has been Fantasy Pancake, and we will see you next time.